Today, we're going to talk about Bitcoin and we're going to be providing an update to the bull market support band. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up. Let's go ahead and jump in. So, it's been a while since we've tested the 20-week SMA. I think we're about, on week 18 or 19 now. So, currently on our 18th week since we last tested it. And to check in with it, we are currently, the 20-week SMA is currently at around 40.7K. 21-week EMA is around 41.1K. So quite a bit, quite a bit below where we currently are after this most recent move to the upside. And one of the things that I've mentioned many times over the last couple of years is that Bitcoin gives you exposure to the upside of crypto while minimizing your downside risk in terms of the Bitcoin dominance, right? We talked about that a lot, and I mean, don't worry, I'm not going to lecture you on the Bitcoin dominance too much in this video, but the whole idea is that as we get further and further into the hiking cycle and all that stuff, Bitcoin tends to absorb liquidity from the rest of the market. We see it in the same way we see it in the stock market, right? We see, the Magnificent Seven continue to do well, and some of them start to fall off as time goes on until you're only left with a few, and then by the end of it, eventually they all, go in for a correction. But in the meantime, one of the things I've mentioned is that if it were to follow last cycle, which there's no guarantees, but it means essentially this risk-on behavior could extend until dominance hits approximately 56%, right? So still 3% above where we currently are in terms of, trying to stay above the bull market support band. Now, one of the interesting things, there's a bit of a pattern here that happened. I don't know if you guys remember, so this wick from February of 2023, where we had like sort of a long wick on either side and then a really small candle body. Basically the same thing happened here in January 2024. So about a year later, 11 months later, very similar candle. And then what's interesting is that after that candle, the following candle in March was a 23% move to the upside. And the following candle here in February is now a 22% move to the upside. A 23% move from the open just puts you at around 52.3K, so just a few $100s higher than where we currently are. So I did want to at least talk a little bit about that and see if, what would it look like if that pattern were to extend. Basically, the idea of falling in here to test the 20-week SMA, we actually had a wick down to it. Over here, we did not quite make it there, but then we saw a fairly aggressive move off of this candle, this candle close here, where Bitcoin rallied on up about 26% to the top of that close. And then from here up to the current prices, we're about 25-26%. So I wanted to follow up and see kind of like what happened after that to get an idea of what could theoretically happen. And what's interesting is, you can see that after these, this larger move to the upside, we essentially just had a few calm weeks where Bitcoin didn't really move a whole lot. And hard to say if that's going to include this week. One of the reasons why it could theoretically include the next couple of weeks isn't Bitcoin related necessarily. It's just that late February tends to not be the best time in the stock market, right? And we've actually seen that here the last couple of weeks, right? The S&P has actually fallen down some. And so that could have something to do with it. I mean, if you were to go back and look at what the if you were to go back and look at what Bitcoin was doing, the week of March, or sorry, the S&P was doing the week of March 20th and the week of March 27th of last year, right? You can see that the S&P was actually below its 20-week moving average at the time. So it wasn't even above it. So Bitcoin was doing quite a bit better than the S&P at the time. But the point is that, if this pattern were to continue, of relatively, maybe a boring week or two after this larger move to the upside, right? We just had a 26% move to the upside just from this candle, not even including the wick. And so over here, there was some consolidation. Perhaps that's what we're getting here. Again, now what eventually happened is a few weeks later, Bitcoin then had another move to the upside by about 7%. Now, 7% from here would put Bitcoin at around 56K. Um, and again, I don't know if it's going to go there, but 56K, I imagine, would lead to sort of that liquidity again going back into Bitcoin. And one of the things that I know, and I know I said I wasn't going to talk about it, but one of the things that I know some people are looking at this week is that, you know, the ETH Bitcoin pair has seen a bit of renewed interest here. And you know, it's still in line with what we saw last cycle. You know, after putting in this, you know, these lows and then coming up here, and kind of the same thing so far. I mean, again, like it doesn't have to play out the same way, but at least let it show us something different to assume that it won't. And you can see ultimately right here, like that ETH Bitcoin had a surge in February, and then it sort of topped out that last week of February, and it ended up being a lower high compared to what happened in December of 2018. And so I think there's a case to be made that Bitcoin could sort of take those reins back as we get into March, right? And then, you know, potentially you see the ETH Bitcoin valuation sort of top out over here, and then, you know, potentially bleed back into Bitcoin, and then perhaps it goes back down to the range lows sometime, you know, between March to May. Right here, it actually made it back down there by May. And what's interesting is if you go back over to Bitcoin and you look at this pattern that Bitcoin has with respect to the 20-week SMA, you know, after this, again, looking at it with monthly candles, after this candle here, right, like long wicks on either side, but a small candle body, large candle body, and then the next one was only about a few percent move up. Now look at it on the weekly. Look at this on the weekly, right, where after this large candle body, a little bit of a move up, and then it finally faded back into the bull market support band by the summertime, right, like by May or June. And what's interesting, though, is if you overlay Bitcoin dominance, I know I said I wasn't going to, but if you overlay Bitcoin dominance on here, you'll see that dominance actually started to take off here, right? Which was before Bitcoin had yet another move to the upside where it went back up to the high. So isn't that interesting? You see dominance started to surge here in May as Bitcoin USD was fading back to the bull market support band. So, you know, essentially what I'm suggesting is if it were to continue to emulate basically that pattern, then it could involve Bitcoin, you know, basically staying up here for a little while in this range. It doesn't mean that it can't. I mean, even over here, there's some pretty long wicks to the downside, right? Like this move here, these were like 5% wicks to the downside. Just to give you some perspective, a 5% drop puts Bitcoin at 49K. So I'm not trying to suggest that it can't do something like that. It certainly could. I just want, you know, to take a look at this pattern. But the dominance actually went up as Bitcoin faded into the 20-week moving average, and then it popped right there, and then the dominance sort of topped out for a little while. And so, you know, maybe something similar ends up happening again. I think the point here, and I've said this for a long time, I know everyone's all over this, you know, everyone wants to talk about alt season and that kind of stuff, but, you know, when it comes to this phase of the cycle, and it shouldn't be a controversial view, it's just that the way that alt season typically happens is from a high dominance level, and it normally also would happen after Bitcoin would hit new highs is when dominance tends to take a nosedive, or dominance could take a nosedive if Bitcoin is unable to hit new all-time highs, and then Bitcoin rolls over. So those are certainly some things that I think we have to consider. But the point here is that, you know, I know everyone wants to go back and talk about like alt season in which alts are pumping and whatnot. But the problem is that, you know, there's not necessarily a clear indication just yet that dominance of Bitcoin has topped out. And if last cycle is any indication, I think that the dominance of Bitcoin could continue to go up to 60%. I know now it feels like 53% is such a low value for dominance, But I mean, all things considered, there haven't been that many weeks in the last few years where the dominance has been this high. I mean, look at where the dominance currently is um, of Bitcoin. There's not been that many weeks where it's even been this high. It's just that, because we saw it recently go to 54 and 55%, 53% feels low. But what I'm trying to say is I think that, yes, Bitcoin is, it's consolidating a little bit here, just like it did previously. Eventually, we know it faded to the 20-week SMA, but that could still take a while. And during that process, the dominance, I think, has plenty of time to ultimately move higher, even if it does have to go check in with its own bull market support band first. As far as Bitcoin USD, some of the other things we've talked about before, one of which is the sort of the extent of these corrections. A lot of them have only been about 20% drops, and I know a lot of people want larger drops, but I was actually very clear, in some of these prior videos, that we might only get 20%. That's what all three of these corrections were, right here, here, and here. All three of those were 20%. I said going into the spot ETF, we could get we likely would get a correction around mid-January. We got one. And it's interesting because I did get some comments from people saying, well, when's the correction going to occur? And I was like, what if we already got it, right? I mean, like, what if that was it? And we get another push higher. And sure enough, that was it. That was it. We did not check in with the bull market support band. And it's been about 18 weeks now. Again, still potentially in the window where if we were to go back down and try to hold it as support, it could still theoretically hold. But the longer we go without doing that, I think the higher the risk is of potentially not holding it whenever we do test it. But as this shows over here, after these big moves up, Bitcoin has a habit of not testing it for a while, right? I mean, that's at least what we've seen. After these moves up, you tend to have to wait at least another 1 to 2 months before we've even tested it. That's what all three of these prior examples would suggest. And so I think that the way you navigate this market, and I've said this for 2 years, for me, is just have a Bitcoin-heavy crypto portfolio. I mean, I get that there's a lot of reasons to want to look at the altcoin market and to chase that stuff. And I will, of course, wish anyone luck. I'm not trying to suggest that all these altcoins will bleed to Bitcoin. But my point is that if the king is absorbing that liquidity, why not just stick with the king over the alts? So that is something that I want to be at least cognizant of, at least for the next few months as we potentially finalize the Bitcoin dominance rally. I do think the dominance will top out this year, but I still think there's probably something left in the tank for Bitcoin dominance, although I know many people at this point would disagree with that, especially considering that ETH Bitcoin has had a fairly nice move up recently. So also, if you were to look at some of the daily moving averages, right, like you got the 50-day and the 100-day, still very similar to these other moves, right? We talked about how it faded into March and then got this move up, right at the 100-day moving average. This is exactly where this held as support, the 100-day moving average. And after it crossed through the 50-day, which we were following pretty closely, back over here after crossing through the 50-day, it then rallied another 25%. Here, after crossing through the 50-day, it's gone up another 23 to 24%. So very similar moves, right? Very similar moves. And even if you were to overlay ETH Bitcoin, right? Even if you were to overlay ETH Bitcoin onto this chart, you can see, in fact, that after Bitcoin had this move and then consolidated for a little bit, ETH Bitcoin had some pretty impressive moves back up. But it still ended up being a lower high. And then eventually it faded back down. And so that's ultimately what I think is the most likely outcome, where, yes, like ETH Bitcoin is going up, but my guess is it does something similar to over here, where it ends up, not really far exceeding the prior high that it put in a few weeks ago. And then Bitcoin sort of absorbs that liquidity back again. And you can see that in where ETH Bitcoin dropped right here was as Bitcoin got that push right there. And then eventually ETH Bitcoin faded as Bitcoin fell back into the bull market support band. So how long would it take for Bitcoin to go to the bull market support band if that pattern were to repeat? Which again, there's no guarantee. And it also is unfortunate that we didn't actually test it right here. But if you were to overlay, say like this pattern right here, where it also bounced off that, it bounced off the 100-day moving average, right? And you were to sort of just overlay it. I mean, we know the wick didn't go as far down, then you're potentially not visiting it. I mean, I don't know how long it'll take, but it suggests that it could still take a few months, potentially as late as May. Could certainly happen before then, but there is the Bitcoin halving coming up in April. We're already almost at the end of February as it is. So really, the question is can Bitcoin hold at these higher levels, for the entire month of March and April? Ultimately, what I think, and I've outlined this several times, I've said that, Bitcoin can stay elevated until we get closer to that 56 to 60% level in dominance. I think that the dominance will help define where Bitcoin's, where that level ultimately is. And it's just a long waiting game. So far that pattern has continued to play out, and we'll see if it continues to do so. And again, right now I know everyone's talking about the spot ETF flows and wondering, well, why hasn't Bitcoin moved? First of all, the spot ETF flows, in my opinion, are they're not really something to spend too much time focusing on. I think the larger issue right now for Bitcoin is that the S&P has had a pretty big pullback here, by about, from the highs. Again, not massive, but from these highs, about a 2% move to about a 2% drop or so. So looking at the S&P in election years, so this is 2024. Here's the average of election years, right? So it is far extended above what normally happens in election years. But if you look at a few case examples, right, 2020 is probably not the best one to compare to, because it is, we did have the pandemic, and I mean, it looks a little bit eerie, but I wouldn't put a lot of weight into that. You could also look at 2016. You could look at 2012, which seems to be following pretty closely. You could look at 2008. Well, 2008 we had a recession. 2004 is actually probably one of the ones that looks the most similar to what we're seeing today in terms of ROI from the yearly open. And I mean, there's just oftentimes, in the first quarter of the halving or of the election year, where you do get some weakness in the S&P 500, and we're starting to see a little bit of that right now, which could be, sort of filtering over into the Bitcoin market and leading to, sort of stagnant price here at 52K, at least for the last few days. But again, same pattern that we saw back over there. So we'll continue to follow that, and we'll continue to look at it with respect to 20-week SMA. You can also look at it in terms of the short-term bubble risk, which is basically the extension from the 20-week SMA, and see that we kind of reached that same level that we reached back over here in terms of being 40% above the 20-week moving average, right? So that's basically been the maximum extension that we've reached in these examples, right? That was about a 40% move above the 20-week SMA. And then right here, we were about 40% above the 20-week SMA. Just for reference, 40% above the current 20-week SMA is actually at around 57K. So that's actually quite a bit higher. And you remember if we said like a 6 to 7% move to the upside from that prior level, that just gets you to 56%. 57K, let me switch this over to a regular scale. So 57K would correspond to the 786, right? So that'd be the 786 fib retracement if it makes it there. So we'll see if it makes it there. If it does, my guess is that the dominance should be getting close to that 56% level. And if it does, we'll of course take inventory of that at the time. Are there any other indicators that I wanted to bring up in this one? I don't believe so. I think that, you know, the other things to maybe watch are like USDT dominance. This is one that we did a video on it a little while ago, and I basically said in that video there's a decent chance that USDT dominance could get rejected here at its own bull market support band, right? So like as Bitcoin, as the total market cap bounced, USDT dominance took a big hit. And the reason we point that out is because if it makes it down to this trend line, that could be sort of a turnaround point, right? You can see that on this trend line, there are some pretty significant dates in Bitcoin's history once it hit that trend line. And I mean, you can see that it's moved from 6.5% down to 5% relatively quickly, only in about a month. So imagine a month or two from now, if it's down at say 4%, where things would be. So that's probably something to look at. And then the other thing to look at might be the stablecoin supply ratio in terms of the SSRO, the stablecoin supply ratio oscillator. You can see that it actually went up to where it was back in 2021 during that January peak. We know that Bitcoin actually went much higher than that January peak, even as the stablecoin supply ratio oscillator dropped. But you can see that as it dropped here, it dropped all the way down to about 0.6 to 0.7, and then it bounced. Kind of the same thing, right? Like it dropped all the way down here to very similar levels, then got a bounce, right? And I don't know exactly how low it dropped over there. Yeah, so about 0.686, I suppose. Which again, you can see very similar move right here on the stablecoin supply ratio oscillator. It then bounced up here, up to about 2, which is precisely where it bounced over here, up to about the 2 level. During that time, though, the price of Bitcoin just kept slowly grinding higher, right? It just kept slowly grinding higher while that was happening. And so that might be something to keep an eye on too, is does that pattern repeat as well? Again, trying to call the exact top is really difficult, and at least before a larger correction. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time trying to do that. What we're trying to look at here are larger trends in the market to identify where Bitcoin dominance potentially tops out. I still think it's going to go higher to the 60% level, and I think that because I think that Bitcoin still needs to chop up altcoins up in this range, way up here. So could still spend some time at these levels before getting a larger drop. And by the way, I mean, for the people that want a larger drop, more than that 20%, just remember, in 2019, once we finally got a larger drop, then like 15% or so, you ended up continuing to get those drops for a while. So just something to keep in mind, that could actually be the tell that the trend is over, is if you actually get a drop that's more than, say, 25%. Because so far, all these drops have just been about 20 to 22%, and nothing more, nothing less, right? 4 distinct drops, about the same level. We were going to get a pullback from the spot ETF, but once we went back to 39K, someone asked if they should sell in hopes of a pre-halving dip. And my response was, well, what if that is the pre-halving dip, right? What if that is the pre-halving dip? And I actually recommended that if your Satoshi value is kind of low, or you don't have as much Bitcoin, that might be an opportunity. So yeah, I mean, at some point we will get a larger pullback in the market, but it's really hard to predict exactly when that's going to happen. We'll just look at these patterns, see if they continue to play out. So far, all these big pushes, all these big, moves up by Bitcoin, then led to sort of like months-long consolidation, sometimes with slightly higher prices, sometimes with not higher prices or only marginally higher, until eventually getting to the 20-week SMA. And I mean, you can see that it's only going to be a matter of time before the 20-week SMA sort of comes up into these levels, right? So if Bitcoin were to spend some time up here and then come back over here and test it in May, then that would be sort of the level to try and hold. But anyways, if you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up.